The emergency klaxons echoed through the corridors of Station Omega-7, their harsh wail cutting through the usual hum of daily operations. Commander Sarah Chen pressed her palm against the biometric scanner, and the reinforced doors of the communications center slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Inside, dozens of technicians hunched over their workstations, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of holographic displays showing star maps, fleet positions, and intercept trajectories. "Status report," Chen commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 15 years fighting humanity's wars among the stars. Lieutenant Torres looked up from his console, sweat beading on his forehead despite the station's climate controls. "Ma'am, we've got confirmation. The Star Assembly fleet is massing at the Proxima Junction. Intelligence estimates put their numbers at over 12,000 vessels." Chen felt her stomach drop. 12,000 ships represented the largest military force ever assembled in known space. The combined fleets of humanity barely numbered 3,000 vessels, and most of those were patrol craft and cargo haulers hastily converted for combat. The Star Assembly had been planning this for decades, maybe centuries. Humanity had been preparing for 3 years. "Time to arrival?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would be worse than expected. 72 hours, ma'am. Maybe less if they push their drives beyond safety margins." Chen nodded grimly. The Star Assembly had never shown much concern for the safety of their crews. The alliance of 12 alien species had ruled the galaxy for over 2 millennia, crushing any race that dared to challenge their authority or refused to submit to their rigid hierarchy. Humanity had made the mistake of saying no to their terms of surrender. The terms had been simple enough on the surface. Humanity would dismantle its military, surrender all weapons technology, and accept placement in the Assembly's caste system. Humans would be classified as a Class 7 species, permitted to exist but forbidden from leaving their home system without explicit permission. They would work in designated roles, breed according to assembly quotas, and gradually fade into the background noise of galactic civilization. The answer from Earth's United Nations had been equally simple: hell no. That had been 3 years ago. 3 years of desperate preparation, of converting every available resource into weapons, ships, and defensive installations. 3 years of knowing that when the Star Assembly came, they would come with overwhelming force and no intention of showing mercy. "Patch me through to Admiral Morrison," Chen ordered. The main display flickered, and the weathered face of Admiral James Morrison appeared. At 68, Morrison was old for a fleet commander, but he had earned his position through 3 decades of service and a tactical mind that had kept humanity alive through dozens of smaller conflicts with Assembly advance forces. "Sarah," Morrison said, his voice carrying across space with only a slight delay, "I assume you've seen the scout reports." 12,000 ships, Admiral. How do we fight 12,000 ships with what we have?" Morrison was quiet for a moment, his eyes focused on something beyond the camera's view. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that Chen had never heard before. "We don't fight them, Commander, not in the traditional sense." "Sir?" 3 years ago, when the Assembly delivered their ultimatum, every military analyst in the solar system ran the numbers. In a straight fight, our best-case scenario gave us a 12% chance of survival. Worst case, we'd be extinct within a week. Chen felt cold despite the station's warmth. "Then what's the plan, sir?" Morrison's expression hardened. "We've been developing something, Project Prometheus. It's been classified above your clearance level, but given current circumstances, you need to know." The display changed, showing what looked like technical schematics for a device Chen didn't recognize. It was roughly spherical, about the size of a small ship, covered in what appeared to be sensor arrays and focusing lenses. "What is it?" Chen asked. "A quantum resonance amplifier," Morrison said. "Dr. Elizabeth Kane's team has been working on it since the ultimatum was delivered. It's based on principles we discovered in the Tau Ceti ruins." Chen knew about Tau Ceti. 5 years ago, human archaeologists had discovered the remains of an ancient civilization on the 4th planet of that system. The ruins were old, older than any other known civilization in the galaxy. The Star Assembly had immediately claimed the site and forbidden further human exploration, but not before Dr. Kane's team had managed to extract several artifacts and data cores. "The device works on a principle the Assembly doesn't understand," Morrison continued. "Quantum entanglement on a stellar scale. Dr. Kane believes she can use it to create a resonance cascade that will affect every assembly ship within a radius of 50 light-years. What kind of effect? Morrison's smile was grim. Their ships will stop working, not just the weapons, not just the engines, everything. Life support, navigation, communications, even their artificial gravity generators. They'll be dead in space. Chen stared at the schematics. That's impossible. No weapon has that kind of range or power. It's not a weapon, Commander. It's a key. The Tau Ceti civilization embedded quantum locks in the fundamental structure of spacetime throughout this region of the galaxy. The assembly has been using technology based on those same quantum principles for millennia, but they never understood the underlying architecture. They've been building their entire technological base on borrowed power, and were about to turn off the switch. The implications hit Chen like a physical blow. If Morrison was right, if this device could really disable every assembly ship in a 50 light-year radius, it would change everything. Not just the current conflict, but the entire balance of power in the galaxy. How long until the device is ready? She asked. Dr. Kane estimates 18 hours. But Sarah, there's something else you need to know. The device can only be activated from within the assembly fleet formation. Someone has to get close enough to deploy it manually. Chen understood immediately. A suicide mission. Not necessarily. The pilot would have approximately 30 seconds between activation and cascade initiation. Enough time to escape in a fast ship if they're lucky and skilled enough. Who's going to do it? Morrison was quiet for a long moment. That hasn't been decided yet, but whoever it is will be carrying the future of the human race in their cargo bay. The comm channel closed, leaving Chen alone with her thoughts and the sound of klaxons still echoing through the station. Around her, the technicians continued their work, monitoring assembly fleet movements and calculating intercept times. They had no idea that humanity's survival might depend on a device they'd never heard of and a mission that bordered on the impossible. Chen pulled up the assembly fleet data on her personal display. 12,000 ships, representing the combined military might of a dozen species. At the center of the formation would be the assembly's flagship, the hegemony's pride, a massive dreadnought that served as both command center and symbol of assembly dominance. The ship was 15 kilometers long and carried a crew of over 100,000 beings. If the quantum resonance device worked as intended, all of those ships would go dark simultaneously. Tens of millions of assembly personnel would find themselves stranded in dead vessels, their life support failing, their communications cut, their weapons offline. It would be the largest military disaster in galactic history. But that was only if the device worked, and if someone could get close enough to deploy it, and if Dr. Kane's team could finish construction in time. Too many variables, Chen thought, too many things that could go wrong. She thought about her daughter, Lisa, who was finishing her engineering degree on Earth. Lisa had wanted to join the Space Force like her mother, but Chen had convinced her to stay in school, to keep learning, to prepare for whatever came after this war, if there was an after. The door to the communications center hissed open, and Dr. Elizabeth Kane entered. Kane was a small woman in her 50s, with prematurely gray hair and the intense focus of someone who spent most of her time thinking about problems that existed on the edge of human understanding. She carried a data pad and looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Commander Chen," Kane said, "Admiral Morrison asked me to brief you on the technical aspects of Project Prometheus." "Doctor, I have to ask, how certain are you that this will work?" Kane set her data pad on the nearest console and called up a three-dimensional model of local space. "Based on our analysis of the Tau Ceti artifacts and 17 months of testing, I'm confident the device will function as designed. The quantum substrate in this region of space shows clear evidence of artificial modification. Whoever built the Tau Ceti civilization embedded quantum resonance patterns throughout the stellar medium." "But you've never tested it on this scale." "No," Kane admitted. "Our largest test affected a volume of space roughly the size of Earth's moon. But the mathematics are sound, and the quantum patterns are consistent across larger areas. The assembly has been using quantum-based technology for over 2,000 years. Their ships, their weapons, their computers, even their environmental systems all rely on quantum field manipulations." Kane highlighted different parts of the display as she spoke. "The quantum resonance device will destabilize those field patterns across a 50 light-year radius. It won't destroy the assembly ships, but it will render them completely inoperable. For how long? Permanently, Kane said. The cascade effect will alter the quantum structure of their technology at the molecular level. They'll have to rebuild everything from scratch, and they'll have to do it without the quantum advantages they've relied on for millennia. Chen studied the display. If Kane was right, the device wouldn't just stop the assembly fleet, it would cripple their entire technological civilization. Doctor, do you understand what you're describing? You're talking about destroying the technological foundation of 12 species. Kane's expression hardened. Commander, 3 years ago the Star Assembly demanded our complete surrender. They wanted to reduce humanity to the status of livestock. When we refused, they began assembling the largest military force in galactic history with the explicit intention of wiping out our species. I understand the implications of what we're doing, but I also understand the alternative. She was right, Chen knew. The Assembly had made their intentions clear. This wasn't a war of conquest, it was a war of extermination. The Assembly had fought dozens of such wars over the centuries, and they had never shown mercy to species that resisted their authority. How long before the device is ready? Chen asked. 17 hours, 43 minutes, Kane said without checking her data pad. We're in the final assembly phase. The quantum resonance matrix is stable, and we've completed integration testing with the delivery system. What kind of delivery system? Kane called up another schematic. A modified reconnaissance ship, fast, stealthy, and equipped with the most advanced sensor suite we've ever built. The pilot will need to penetrate the assembly formation and deploy the device within 5,000 kilometers of their flagship. 5,000 kilometers, Chen shook her head. That's point-blank range for a fleet engagement. The device needs to be positioned at the gravitational center of the assembly formation for maximum effect, Kane explained. The flagship will be at that center, surrounded by thousands of escort vessels. Chen thought about the pilot who would have to fly that mission. Whoever it was would have to navigate through the most heavily defended space in galactic history, deploy the device under combat conditions, and somehow escape before the cascade effect trapped them along with the assembly fleet. Who's going to fly it? She asked. Kane was quiet for a moment. Admiral Morrison is reviewing pilot candidates now. It has to be someone with extensive combat experience, advanced infiltration training, and the technical knowledge to operate the device under battlefield conditions. Chen nodded, though she suspected she already knew who Morrison would choose. There were perhaps a dozen pilots in the entire human fleet who had the necessary qualifications, and most of them were already assigned to critical missions. The pool of candidates was very small. The communications console chimed, and Lieutenant Torres looked up. Commander, we're receiving a priority transmission from Earth Command. On screen, the display showed President Maria Santos addressing the camera from the Emergency Command Center beneath Geneva. Behind her, Chen could see military advisors and government officials, their faces grim. Citizens of Earth and the outer colonies, Santos began. I'm speaking to you now from Earth Command as the Star Assembly fleet approaches our space. 3 years ago, when the Assembly demanded our surrender, we chose to fight rather than accept slavery. Today, that fight comes to us. I won't lie to you about our situation. The enemy fleet outnumbers us by more than 4 to 1. Our military analysts have advised me that our chances of survival in a conventional engagement are minimal, but we are not fighting a conventional war. For the past 3 years, our scientists and engineers have been developing new technologies based on discoveries made in the Tau Ceti system. These technologies give us capabilities the Star Assembly doesn't understand and cannot counter. In the next 72 hours, we will demonstrate to the galaxy that humanity does not kneel to tyrants. Santos paused, looking directly into the camera. To the citizens of Earth and the colonies, I ask you to remain calm and trust in our military forces. To the members of the Star Assembly fleet, I have a simple message. You were warned 3 years ago that humanity would never surrender. You chose to ignore that warning. Now you will learn why that was a mistake. This is President Santos, speaking for the United Earth Government and all human colonies. We remain free, we remain defiant, and we will not yield. The transmission ended, leaving the communications center in silence. Chen felt a chill run down her spine. Santos had just broadcast humanity's final ultimatum to the Star Assembly. There would be no further negotiations, no last-minute diplomatic solutions. In 72 hours, one side or the other would be finished forever. "Commander," Torres said quietly, "I'm receiving reports from our scout ships. The assembly fleet has increased speed. New estimated arrival time is 64 hours. Chen nodded. The assembly commanders had probably intercepted Santos's transmission and understood its implications. They were accelerating their timeline, trying to arrive before humanity could implement whatever surprise they were planning. They had no idea what was coming. In less than 18 hours, Dr. Kane's quantum resonance device would be ready. Then someone would have to carry it into the heart of the enemy fleet and activate it. If that mission succeeded, the Star Assembly's technological superiority would become their greatest weakness. If it failed, humanity would face extinction. Chen looked around the communications center at the men and women who had dedicated their lives to defending human civilization. Tomorrow, they would either be celebrating the greatest victory in human history, or they would be dead. There was no middle ground. Captain Marcus Ghost Rodriguez had earned his call sign the hard way. Over 8 years of deep reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines, he had infiltrated assembly installations that were supposed to be impregnable, gathered intelligence that had saved thousands of human lives, and escaped from situations that should have been his tomb. His service record was classified so far above most people's clearance level that officially, he didn't exist. Now he sat in Admiral Morrison's briefing room aboard the flagship Defiance, studying holographic displays that showed the most detailed intelligence humanity had ever gathered about assembly fleet formations. The data was overwhelming: tactical assessments, ship classifications, estimated crew complements, weapon loadouts, and defensive capabilities of over 12,000 enemy vessels. "The device has to be placed here," Dr. Kane said, highlighting a point in space at the exact center of the assembly formation. "Within 5,000 kilometers of their flagship. The quantum resonance effect diminishes exponentially with distance from the gravitational center of their fleet." Rodriguez studied the tactical display. The assembly flagship Hegemony's pride sat at the heart of a defensive formation that looked like a three-dimensional maze of interlocking fields of fire. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and escort vessels created overlapping sensor networks and weapon zones that extended for thousands of kilometers in all directions. "What kind of stealth capabilities does the delivery ship have?" he asked. Admiral Morrison activated another display. "The Shadowhawk is a prototype reconnaissance vessel built specifically for this mission. It incorporates every stealth technology we've developed over the past 3 years, plus several innovations based on Tau Ceti artifacts." The ship that appeared on the display was sleek and angular, its hull covered in materials that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It was small, perhaps a quarter the size of a standard frigate, but every line of its design spoke to speed and concealment. "The hull is composed of quantum phase metamaterials," Kane explained. "It can shift its electromagnetic signature to match background space conditions. To most sensors, it will appear to be empty space or cosmic debris." "Most sensors," Rodriguez repeated. "What about the others?" Morrison looked grim. "The assembly has been upgrading their detection capabilities since we started conducting deep reconnaissance missions. Their newest ships carry quantum resonance scanners that can detect molecular displacement patterns. If you get within direct scanning range of one of their advanced sensor platforms, they'll find you." Rodriguez nodded. He had expected as much. Every mission pushed the boundaries of what was possible, and the enemy adapted just as humans did. Range of their best sensors: approximately 800 kilometers for a ship the size of the Shadowhawk. "And I need to get within 5,000 kilometers of their flagship." "Yes." Rodriguez studied the formation again. The assembly had arranged their fleet in a classic defensive pattern, with their most powerful ships forming an outer perimeter and increasingly specialized vessels protecting the command ship at the center. It was a formation designed to repel massive frontal assaults by equally massive fleets. It wasn't designed to stop a single small ship, operated by someone willing to die to complete the mission. "What's my insertion window?" Rodriguez asked. "The assembly fleet will drop out of hyperspace at the edge of the solar system in approximately 58 hours, Morrison said. "They'll need several hours to reform their fleet after the transition and begin their approach to Earth. That's your best opportunity." They'll be most vulnerable during the transition, Kane added. Their quantum field generators will be cycling down from hyperspace configuration to normal space operations. For about 20 minutes, their sensor efficiency will be reduced by approximately 30%. Rodriguez had conducted insertions during hyperspace transitions before. It was dangerous work, requiring precise timing and an intimate knowledge of enemy procedures, but it was possible. The real challenge would be maintaining concealment during the hours-long approach to the flagship. Once I deploy the device, how long until activation? The quantum resonance needs 47 seconds to propagate through the assembly fleet formation, Kane said. After that, you'll have approximately 30 seconds before the cascade effect reaches its full intensity. Rodriguez did the math in his head. 77 seconds total from deployment to maximum effect. In ship combat terms, that was a very long time. Long enough for enemy vessels to target and destroy the Shadowhawk dozens of times over if they detected it. What happens to ships caught in the cascade effect? He asked. Complete systems failure, Kane said. Power generation, propulsion, weapons, life support, artificial gravity, communications. Everything stops working simultaneously. The quantum patterns that allow their technology to function will be permanently altered. Permanently? The assembly will have to rebuild their entire technological infrastructure from the ground up. It could take them centuries to reach their current capabilities again, and they'll have to do it without the quantum advantages they've relied on. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair. If the mission succeeded, it would effectively end the Star Assembly's dominance of the galaxy. 12 species that had ruled space for 2 millennia would find themselves reduced to the technological level of pre-industrial civilizations. If the mission failed, humanity would be extinct within days. I need to see the ship, he said. 20 minutes later, Rodriguez stood in Launch Bay 7, looking up at the Shadowhawk. The ship was even more impressive in person than it had been on the displays. Its hull seemed to shift and change as he moved, never quite reflecting light the way normal materials did. The overall effect was unsettling, as if he were looking at a hole in space shaped like a spacecraft. She's beautiful, said Lieutenant Sarah Voss, the Shadowhawk's chief engineer. Voss was young, perhaps 28, but she had worked on the ship's development from its initial design phase. Every system has been optimized for stealth and speed. She can accelerate at 12 gravities without breaking her structural integrity, and her quantum phase hull can maintain perfect sensor invisibility for up to 6 hours at a time. Rodriguez walked around the ship, examining its exterior features. The hull was seamless, with no visible weapons ports or sensor arrays. Everything had been integrated into the ship's structure to minimize its electromagnetic signature. What about weapons? He asked. 2 quantum torpedo tubes and a single particle beam projector, Voss said. Nothing that would help in a fleet engagement, but enough to deal with individual escort vessels if necessary. Rodriguez climbed aboard through the ship's single airlock. The interior was cramped but efficient, with every available space optimized for the mission. The cockpit featured the most advanced flight control system he had ever seen, with holographic displays that provided 3-dimensional representations of surrounding space. The navigation system is linked to our deep space reconnaissance network, Voss explained. You'll have real-time intelligence on assembly fleet movements and positioning. The tactical computer can calculate optimal approach vectors automatically, but you can override it if necessary. Rodriguez settled into the pilot's seat and began familiarizing himself with the controls. The flight interface was intuitive, designed to minimize the pilot's workload during high-stress situations. Most of the ship's systems could be operated through voice commands or neural interface protocols. How long until the device is ready? He asked. Dr. Kane's team will complete final assembly in 14 hours, Voss said. Installation aboard the Shadowhawk will take another 2 hours. You'll have approximately 6 hours for systems checks and mission rehearsal before launch window. Rodriguez nodded. It was a tight timeline, but manageable. He had conducted missions with less preparation time and higher risk factors. Of course, none of those missions had carried the stakes of this one. I want to review the assembly fleet data one more time, he said, especially their sensor protocols and defensive patterns. Voss activated the ship's tactical display. We've identified 17 different ship classes in their formation, each with distinct sensor capabilities and reaction times. The newest designs carry quantum resonance scanners that can penetrate our stealth systems if you get too close. The display showed detailed schematics of assembly vessels, with their sensor ranges highlighted in different colors. Rodriguez studied the patterns, looking for gaps in coverage and potential approach routes. The assembly formation was formidable, but it wasn't perfect. No formation ever was. "What about their command and control structure?" he asked. "The flagship hegemony's Pride serves as the primary command node," Voss explained. "It coordinates fleet movements and tactical decisions for the entire force. If the quantum cascade succeeds, their command structure will collapse completely." Rodriguez smiled grimly. The assembly had built their fleet around centralized command authority, which made them efficient but also vulnerable. With their flagship disabled, the remaining ships would be unable to coordinate their response effectively. "Lieutenant," he said, "I need you to prepare detailed mission files for every aspect of this operation. Ship capabilities, enemy intelligence, approach vectors, escape routes, everything." "Yes, sir. Is there anything specific you want me to focus on?" Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, looking at the tactical display. "Contingency plans. What happens if the primary approach route is compromised? What happens if the device fails to deploy properly? What happens if I don't make it out?" Voss looked uncomfortable. "Sir, Dr. Kane is confident that the device will function as designed." "Dr. Kane is a brilliant scientist, but she's never flown a combat mission," Rodriguez said. "In my experience, the enemy gets a vote in how operations proceed, and they rarely vote the way we want them to." He stood up and walked to the ship's single viewport. Outside, he could see technicians working on other vessels in the launch bay, preparing them for what might be humanity's final battle. Many of those ships would never return. Many of the people working on them would be dead within days. "Lieutenant Voss, I want you to understand something. This mission has approximately a 15% chance of success. That estimate assumes everything goes perfectly: perfect stealth, perfect timing, perfect deployment, and perfect escape. In reality, at least half of those factors will go wrong." "Then why are you taking the mission?" Rodriguez turned back to her. "Because 15% is better than 0%, and 0% is what we have if we try to fight the assembly fleet in a conventional engagement." Voss nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to make sure this ship performs exactly as advertised. When I'm flying through the middle of 12,000 enemy vessels, I can't afford to have a system failure or a sensor malfunction. The quantum phase hull, the navigation systems, the deployment mechanism for the device, everything has to work perfectly." "It will, sir, I guarantee it." Rodriguez hoped she was right. He had flown missions where equipment failures had nearly gotten him killed, and he had learned to prepare for every possible contingency. But this mission was different. There would be no backup plans, no extraction teams, no second chances. He would get one opportunity to place the quantum resonance device in the correct position and activate it. If anything went wrong, humanity would face extinction. He spent the next 4 hours reviewing mission data and familiarizing himself with the Shadowhawk systems. The ship was more advanced than anything he had ever flown, incorporating technologies that pushed the boundaries of human engineering. The quantum phase hull could maintain perfect stealth for hours at a time. The navigation system could calculate approach vectors that avoided enemy sensor coverage. The life support systems could sustain him for days if necessary. But all of that technology depended on a successful insertion into the assembly fleet formation. If the enemy detected him during the approach, no amount of advanced engineering would save him. Rodriguez had always known that his career would probably end with a mission he wouldn't survive. Deep reconnaissance pilots had one of the highest casualty rates in the Space Force, and he had already survived far longer than statistics suggested he should. But he had never imagined that his final mission would carry the fate of the entire human species. The intercom crackled. "Captain Rodriguez to the briefing room, Priority Alpha." Rodriguez made his way back to Admiral Morrison's briefing room, where he found the Admiral, Dr. Kane, and several other senior officers gathered around a tactical display. The display showed real-time intelligence from humanity's deep space surveillance network. "The assembly fleet has accelerated again," Morrison said without preamble. "New estimated arrival time is 52 hours. They're pushing their engines beyond recommended safety limits." Rodriguez studied the updated projections. They know we're planning something. That's our assessment, Morrison agreed. They intercepted President Santos's broadcast and understood its implications. They're trying to arrive before we can implement whatever surprise we're preparing. How does this affect the mission timeline? Dr. Kane stepped forward. We can complete device construction 6 hours early if necessary. The critical factor is the assembly fleet's transition from hyperspace to normal space. That's still our best insertion window. Rodriguez nodded. The accelerated timeline actually worked in his favor. Less time for the assembly to refine their defensive preparations, less time for them to adapt to changing circumstances. In his experience, rushed operations often created opportunities that careful planning couldn't provide. I want to launch 12 hours early, he said. Position the Shadowhawk at the edge of the system before the assembly arrives. When they transition to normal space, I'll already be in position to begin my approach. Morrison looked skeptical. That means 12 hours in space with no support and limited communications. If something goes wrong, we won't be able to help you. Admiral, once I enter the assembly formation, you won't be able to help me anyway. The extra time will let me study their actual defensive patterns instead of relying on intelligence estimates. Kane pulled up technical specifications for the quantum resonance device. The device will be ready in 8 hours. Installation and final systems checks will take 4 hours. That gives us exactly the timeline we need. Rodriguez felt the familiar pre-mission tension building in his chest. In less than 12 hours, he would be alone in space, carrying humanity's last hope toward the largest enemy fleet in galactic history. The odds against success were overwhelming, but he had faced overwhelming odds before. The difference was that this time, failure meant the end of everything he had ever fought to protect. Gentlemen, he said, I suggest we get to work. The quantum resonance device sat in the Shadowhawk's cargo bay like a metallic sphere of condensed starlight. Dr. Elizabeth Kane ran her hands over its surface one final time, checking connections and verifying that all systems showed green status indicators. The device represented 4 years of theoretical research, 18 months of practical development, and the combined hopes of the entire human species. Final diagnostics complete, she announced to the team of technicians gathered around the ship. All quantum field generators are operating within normal parameters. Resonance matrix is stable and ready for deployment. Captain Rodriguez stood nearby, already wearing his flight suit and reviewing mission parameters on a handheld display. In 6 hours, he would climb into the Shadowhawk's cockpit and begin the most dangerous infiltration mission in human history. The tension was visible in the way he held himself, the careful economy of movement that came from years of operating in hostile space. Dr. Kane, he said without looking up from his display, walk me through the deployment sequence one more time. Kane activated the holographic projector mounted on the cargo bay wall. The display showed a 3-dimensional representation of the quantum resonance device and its deployment mechanism. When you reach the target coordinates, you'll release the device from the cargo bay. It will drift for approximately 30 seconds while its internal systems complete final calibration. 30 seconds, Rodriguez repeated. That's a long time to maintain position in the middle of an enemy fleet. The device needs time to synchronize with the local quantum field patterns, Kane explained. Once synchronization is complete, you'll receive an activation prompt on your tactical display. Single key press to activate, then you have 77 seconds until full cascade effect. Rodriguez nodded. And if the assembly detects the device during those 30 seconds? The device is shielded with the same quantum phase materials as your ship, Kane said. To their sensors, it should appear to be a piece of space debris or a minor asteroid fragment. But if they perform detailed scans at close range, they'll know exactly what it is, Rodriguez finished the thought. How close is close range? Approximately 200 kilometers for a detailed quantum resonance scan. Rodriguez studied the assembly fleet formation data on his display. The enemy ships were arranged in a complex 3-dimensional pattern, with individual vessels separated by distances measured in thousands of kilometers. But the flagship hegemony's pride would be surrounded by escort vessels at much closer range. What about the activation signal? He asked. Will the assembly be able to detect that? Kane shook her head. The activation uses quantum entanglement protocols. The signal propagates instantaneously without any detectable electromagnetic signature. They won't know the device has been activated until their ship starts shutting down. That was something, at least. Rodriguez had participated in enough covert operations to know that the enemy's ability to detect mission-critical signals often determined success or failure. Quantum entanglement offered perfect security, but it also meant there would be no way to confirm activation until the cascade effect began. Admiral Morrison entered the cargo bay, accompanied by several senior officers. "Captain, we've received updated intelligence from our deep space surveillance network. The assembly fleet has begun preliminary deceleration. They'll transition to normal space in approximately 14 hours. "Any changes to their formation?" Rodriguez asked. "They're maintaining standard defensive patterns," Morrison replied. "But our intelligence analysts believe they may implement enhanced security protocols once they enter the solar system." Rodriguez wasn't surprised. The assembly had been fighting wars for over 2 millennia, and they had learned to adapt their tactics to changing circumstances. They would be expecting some kind of human resistance, even if they didn't understand the specific nature of the threat they were facing. "Admiral," he said, "I recommend launching in 4 hours instead of 6. The earlier I get into position, the better my chances of successful insertion." Morrison looked to Dr. Kane. "Will the device be ready?" "Final systems integration is complete," Kane confirmed. "We can accelerate the pre-flight checklist if necessary." "Do it," Morrison ordered. "Captain Rodriguez, you'll launch at 800 hours. Transit time to the edge of the system is approximately 8 hours. That puts you in position 2 hours before the assembly fleet arrives." Rodriguez felt the familiar pre-mission calm settling over him. The timeline was set, the equipment was ready, and the target was approaching. Everything else was beyond his control, which meant it was time to stop worrying about variables he couldn't influence and focus on the variables he could. "I'll want to run one final systems check," he said. "Full power test of the stealth systems and a complete diagnostic of the navigation array." "Lieutenant Voss will assist you," Morrison said. "She knows the Shadowhawk systems better than anyone." The next 4 hours passed in a blur of technical preparations and final briefings. Rodriguez ran through every conceivable scenario with the mission planning team, identifying potential problems and developing contingency responses. He reviewed assembly fleet data until he could identify individual ship classes by their electromagnetic signatures alone. He practiced the deployment sequence until he could execute it in complete darkness using only muscle memory. Most importantly, he spent time in the Shadowhawk's cockpit, familiarizing himself with the ship's unique flight characteristics. The quantum phase hull created subtle changes in the vessel's aerodynamics and maneuvering capabilities. The stealth systems required constant monitoring to maintain optimal efficiency. The navigation array provided more detailed information than any system he had ever used, but processing that information required practice and experience. "Captain," Lieutenant Voss said as he completed the final pre-flight checklist, "all systems are showing optimal status. The quantum phase hull is operating at maximum efficiency, and the device deployment mechanism has passed all diagnostic tests." Rodriguez nodded, his attention focused on the tactical display that showed current intelligence on assembly fleet movements. The enemy formation was massive, stretching across thousands of cubic kilometers of space. At its center, the flagship Hegemony's Pride commanded a force that could devastate entire star systems. "Lieutenant, I want you to monitor my progress from the communications center," he said. "If something goes wrong during the mission, you'll need to brief my replacement on the ship's capabilities and limitations." Voss looked uncomfortable. "Sir, you're going to complete the mission successfully." Rodriguez smiled. "I intend to try, but in my experience, enemy fleets don't usually cooperate with human mission planning. If the worst happens, make sure the next pilot has every advantage we can give him." He sealed his helmet and began the final engine startup sequence. The Shadowhawk's quantum drives came online with barely a whisper, their output carefully modulated to minimize detectable emissions. On his tactical display, the ship's stealth systems showed green status across the board. "Shadowhawk to control," he said into his comm system. "Pre-flight complete, ready for departure." "Control to Shadowhawk," came Admiral Morrison's voice. "You are cleared for launch. Good hunting, Captain." The Shadowhawk lifted from the launch bay floor and moved smoothly toward the exit doors. Outside, Rodriguez could see the curve of Station Omega-7's hull and the distant glow of the sun. In a few hours, this view would be replaced by the sight of 12,000 enemy warships arranged in the most powerful military formation ever assembled. As the station fell behind, Rodriguez activated the ship's long-range sensors and began scanning for assembly advance scouts. The enemy would have deployed reconnaissance vessels ahead of their main fleet, watching for human defensive preparations and gathering intelligence on Earth's orbital installations. Those scouts represented the first challenge of his mission. The Shadowhawk's quantum phase hull shifted to maximum stealth configuration as Rodriguez detected the electromagnetic signature of an assembly reconnaissance ship. The enemy vessel was small and fast, designed for deep space surveillance rather than combat. Its sensors swept space in regular patterns, looking for any sign of human military activity. Rodriguez adjusted his course to take advantage of the reconnaissance ship's sensor shadows. The assembly used quantum-based detection systems that were incredibly sensitive but also highly directional. By timing his movements to coincide with the gaps in their scanning patterns, he could remain invisible even at relatively close range. The technique required precise timing and an intimate knowledge of enemy sensor capabilities. Rodriguez had spent years studying assembly technology, learning to exploit the weaknesses in their defensive systems. The quantum phase hull gave him capabilities the assembly had never encountered before, but he couldn't rely on technology alone. 3 hours into his flight, Rodriguez detected the first signs of the approaching assembly fleet. Gravitational anomalies at the edge of the solar system indicated massive objects moving at significant fractions of light speed. The enemy force was still in hyperspace, but their approach was creating measurable disturbances in local spacetime. "Shadowhawk to control," he reported. "Detecting gravitational signatures consistent with large fleet movement, the assembly is maintaining their projected arrival schedule." "Control to Shadowhawk," Morrison's voice crackled through the quantum communications link. "Copy that, Captain. Our deep space sensors confirm your readings. Estimated transition to normal space in 6 hours, 12 minutes. Rodriguez continued his approach to the predetermined insertion point. The location had been carefully chosen based on months of analysis of assembly operational procedures. When the enemy fleet transitioned from hyperspace, they would need several hours to reform their defensive patterns and begin their approach to Earth. During that reformation period, their sensor coverage would be incomplete, and their command structure would be focused on fleet coordination rather than perimeter security. It was the best opportunity he was likely to get. As he approached the insertion point, Rodriguez began detecting more assembly reconnaissance vessels. The enemy had deployed a comprehensive surveillance network throughout the outer solar system, with overlapping sensor coverage designed to detect any human military activity. The number of scout ships was impressive, suggesting that the assembly was taking the threat of human resistance seriously. Rodriguez smiled grimly. They had no idea how seriously they should be taking it. "Shadowhawk to control," he reported. "I'm detecting 17 enemy reconnaissance vessels in my operational area, deploying to insertion point Alpha 7. Control to Shadowhawk. Copy 17 enemy contacts. Maintain stealth protocols and report when you reach insertion point." The insertion point was located in the shadow of a small asteroid, chosen because its irregular surface would help mask the Shadowhawk's electromagnetic signature. Rodriguez maneuvered carefully into position, using the asteroid's natural gravitational field to help conceal his ship's drive emissions. Once in position, he powered down all non-essential systems and began the waiting phase of his mission. For the next several hours, he would remain hidden while the assembly fleet transitioned from hyperspace and began their approach to Earth. The waiting was always the hardest part of covert operations, the time when doubt and second-guessing could undermine a pilot's confidence. Rodriguez had learned long ago to use the waiting time constructively. He reviewed mission parameters, studied enemy fleet data, and mentally rehearsed every aspect of the operation. He also spent time thinking about the people he was fighting to protect. His sister Maria, who taught engineering at the university on Mars. His nephew David, who was just starting flight training with the civilian Space Corps. Millions of human beings throughout the solar system who had no idea that their survival depended on the success of a single covert mission. 4 hours after reaching the insertion point, Rodriguez detected the first signs of the assembly fleet's arrival. Space itself seemed to shiver as massive objects forced their way back into normal space-time, their transition creating gravitational waves that propagated outward at the speed of light. The effect was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. "Assembly fleet transition detected," he reported. "Gravitational wave patterns consistent with approximately 12,000 vessels. Control to Shadowhawk, we confirm fleet transition. You are authorized to begin approach when ready." Rodriguez brought the Shadowhawk systems back to full operational status. The quantum phase hull shifted to maximum stealth configuration, and the navigation array began scanning for optimal approach vectors. On his tactical display, he could see the enemy fleet beginning to form up in their defensive pattern. 12,000 ships, representing the combined military might of a dozen alien species. The most powerful war fleet in galactic history, commanded by officers who had never known defeat and supported by technology that had dominated space for over 2 millennia. Rodriguez adjusted his flight controls and began his approach. It was time to teach the Star Assembly what it meant to threaten humanity. The assembly fleet stretched across space like a three-dimensional constellation of death. From Rodriguez's position 2,000 kilometers away, the enemy formation was a breathtaking display of military power that made his throat dry despite years of combat experience. Battleships the size of small cities hung in perfect geometric patterns, their hulls bristling with weapons that could crack planets. Escort vessels moved between the larger ships like schools of metallic fish, their sensor arrays sweeping space in coordinated patterns that left no gap in coverage. At the center of the formation, the flagship Hegemony's Pride dominated everything around it. The massive dreadnought was 15 kilometers long and 5 kilometers wide, its hull covered in armor plating that could withstand direct hits from stellar-class weapons. Command towers jutted from its superstructure like the spines of some prehistoric beast, each one housing command centers that coordinated the activities of thousands of ships. Rodriguez studied his tactical display, analyzing the real-time intelligence his sensors were gathering about assembly defensive patterns. The enemy formation was even more complex than human intelligence had predicted, with multiple layers of overlapping sensor coverage and carefully coordinated patrol routes that eliminated most potential infiltration vectors. But not all of them. The assembly had arranged their fleet according to classical military doctrine, designed to repel massive frontal assaults by equally massive enemy forces. Their sensor networks were optimized to detect large ships at extreme range, not small stealth vessels operating at close proximity. Their patrol patterns assumed threats would approach from predictable vectors, not from the seemingly empty space between their own vessels. Rodriguez identified a narrow gap in their coverage, a corridor barely 5 kilometers wide that ran between two destroyer squadrons toward the fleet's center. The gap would only exist for approximately 12 minutes before the patrol patterns shifted and closed it off. He would have to time his approach perfectly. "Shadowhawk to control," he whispered into his comm system, keeping his transmission power at the absolute minimum required for communication. "Beginning final approach. Enemy formation analyzed and infiltration route identified." "Control to Shadowhawk," Admiral Morrison's voice crackled back, distorted by distance and interference. "Copy final approach. You are weapons-free and authorized to complete the mission." Rodriguez disconnected the communication link. From this point forward, he would be operating in complete radio silence. The assembly had quantum-sensitive detection equipment that could identify communication signals at enormous distances, and he couldn't risk detection during the most critical phase of his mission. The Shadowhawk's quantum phase hull shimmered as Rodriguez adjusted its stealth configuration to match the electromagnetic background of local space. To assembly sensors, his ship would appear to be a small piece of cosmic debris, perhaps a fragment of asteroid material or the remnant of some ancient collision. The disguise wasn't perfect, but it only needed to work for the 27 minutes required to reach deployment range of the enemy flagship. Rodriguez began his approach, accelerating slowly to avoid creating detectable drive emissions. The Shadowhawk moved through space like a ghost, its advanced propulsion systems operating at the very edge of their stealth capabilities. On his tactical display, he could see enemy patrol ships passing within hundreds of kilometers of his position, their sensors sweeping space in regular patterns that missed him by margins measured in fractions of seconds. The first challenge came after 8 minutes, when an assembly cruiser altered its patrol route and moved directly into Rodriguez's planned flight path. The enemy ship was massive, over 2 kilometers long, with sensor arrays that could detect molecular displacement at close range. Rodriguez had no choice but to adjust his course, adding 3 minutes to his approach time and bringing him dangerously close to a destroyer squadron's sensor perimeter. He held his breath as the Shadowhawk passed within 50 kilometers of the destroyers. At that range, the enemy's quantum resonance scanners should have been able to penetrate his stealth systems and identify his ship's true nature. But the quantum phase hull held, its artificial signature masking the Shadowhawk's electromagnetic profile so effectively that the destroyers continued their patrol without any indication they had detected an intruder. 15 minutes into his approach, Rodriguez encountered his second challenge. A squadron of assembly escort vessels had broken from their assigned patrol pattern and begun conducting what appeared to be a random search of the space between major fleet elements. The escorts were small and fast, designed specifically for anti-infiltration operations. Their sensors were optimized to detect exactly the kind of threat Rodriguez represented. Rodriguez watched the escort's movements on his tactical display, analyzing their search pattern and looking for gaps he could exploit. The enemy vessels were conducting a thorough sweep, but they were following standard assembly doctrine, which assumed infiltrators would try to avoid detection entirely. They weren't prepared for someone who was willing to get close enough to touch their hulls. Rodriguez waited until the lead escort was directly above his position, then accelerated upward along the enemy ship's drive wake. The electromagnetic disturbance created by the escort's engines masked his own drive signature, allowing him to pass within 10 kilometers of the vessel without triggering its proximity alarms. The technique was dangerous, requiring perfect timing and precise maneuvering, but it worked. 20 minutes into his approach, Rodriguez reached the inner perimeter of the assembly formation. Here, the enemy ships were packed more tightly together, their overlapping sensor networks creating a nearly impenetrable barrier against conventional infiltration attempts. But Rodriguez wasn't using conventional tactics. Instead of trying to avoid the enemy sensors entirely, he began using them against each other. Assembly sensor systems were designed to filter out returns from their own ships, creating blind spots in their coverage that a skilled pilot could exploit. Rodriguez threaded the Shadowhawk through these blind spots, using the enemy vessels themselves as cover while he approached the formation center. The technique required an intimate knowledge of assembly sensor capabilities and real-time analysis of their electronic emissions. Rodriguez had spent years studying enemy technology, but this was the first time he had tried to exploit their systems on such a massive scale. Every few seconds, he had to adjust his course to take advantage of new sensor shadows created by the movement of enemy ships. 25 minutes into his approach, Rodriguez caught his first clear view of the hegemony's pride. The massive flagship loomed ahead like a metallic mountain, its hull covered in weapons emplacements and sensor arrays. The ship was surrounded by a dense formation of escort vessels, their defensive pattern designed to protect the fleet's command structure from any possible threat. Rodriguez studied the escort formation, looking for a gap large enough for the Shadowhawk to pass through. The enemy ships were arranged in a complex three-dimensional pattern that provided complete coverage of all approach vectors. There was no way to reach the flagship without passing through their defensive perimeter. But Rodriguez wasn't planning to avoid the escorts. He was planning to join them. The Shadowhawk's quantum phase hull could mimic the electromagnetic signature of other vessels, and Rodriguez had spent hours studying the emissions patterns of assembly escort ships. With careful manipulation of his ship's stealth systems, he could make the Shadowhawk appear to be just another escort vessel conducting routine patrol operations. Rodriguez adjusted his ship's signature to match that of a standard assembly destroyer and moved into formation with the enemy escorts. To their sensors, he would appear to be one of their own ships, perhaps returning from a patrol mission or responding to new orders from Fleet Command. The disguise would only work at long range, but he only needed it to work for a few minutes. The Shadowhawk moved through the escort formation like it belonged there, its false electromagnetic signature fooling the enemy sensor systems completely. Rodriguez passed within hundreds of meters of assembly vessels, whose crews had no idea they were sharing space with a human infiltrator carrying their doom in his cargo bay. 27 minutes into his approach, Rodriguez reached the deployment zone. He was now less than 5,000 kilometers from the hegemony's pride, close enough to see individual weapon turrets on the flagship's hull. The quantum resonance device in his cargo bay showed green status indicators across the board, ready for deployment at a moment's notice. Rodriguez brought the Shadowhawk to a complete stop, using the gravitational field of a nearby assembly battleship to maintain his position. On his tactical display, he could see the complex patterns of enemy ship movements around him, thousands of vessels conducting the routine operations of a fleet preparing for battle. They had no idea that their technological superiority was about to become their greatest weakness. He activated the cargo bay controls and watched as the bay doors opened silently in the vacuum of space. The quantum resonance device drifted away from the Shadowhawk, its internal systems beginning the 30-second calibration sequence that would prepare it for activation. To assembly sensors, it would appear to be a small piece of debris, too insignificant to warrant investigation. Rodriguez watched the timer on his tactical display count down the seconds until the device would be ready for activation. 30 seconds had never seemed so long. Around him, enemy ships continued their routine operations, unaware that humanity's ultimate weapon was floating in space among them, preparing to unleash forces that would reshape the balance of power in the galaxy. 25 seconds. Rodriguez scanned the surrounding space for any sign that the assembly had detected the device. Their patrol ships continued their routine movements, their sensor sweeps following standard patterns. No alerts, no course changes, no indication that they suspected anything unusual. 20 seconds. The hegemony's pride loomed ahead, its massive bulk blocking out the stars. Rodriguez could see lights moving across the flagship's hull, maintenance craft, and supply vessels conducting the routine operations that kept a ship of that size functioning. Somewhere inside that vast structure, assembly commanders were planning the final assault on Earth, confident in their overwhelming superiority. 15 seconds. Rodriguez thought about the billions of human beings throughout the solar system who were counting on him to complete this mission. His sister Maria, his nephew David, President Santos, Admiral Morrison, Dr. Kane, Lieutenant Voss, all the technicians and engineers and soldiers who had made this moment possible. The entire future of the human race came down to the next few minutes. 10 seconds. Rodriguez gripped the activation control, ready to send the signal that would change everything. The assembly had ruled the galaxy for over 2 millennia, crushing any species that dared to challenge their authority. Today, humanity would teach them that even the mightiest empires could fall. 5 seconds. The timer reached 0, and Rodriguez's tactical display showed the activation prompt. Single key press to activate, then 77 seconds until the cascade effect reached full intensity. 77 seconds to escape or die trying. Rodriguez pressed the activation key. Deep within the quantum resonance device, forces beyond human understanding began to stir. The device accessed quantum patterns that had been embedded in the fabric of space-time for millions of years, patterns created by a civilization so ancient that even the assembly had forgotten their existence. The Tau Ceti ruins had been humanity's key to unlocking these patterns, and now that key was about to open a door that would change the galaxy forever. Rodriguez didn't wait to see the effects. He was already accelerating away from the deployment zone, pushing the Shadowhawk's engines to their maximum output while maintaining stealth configuration. He had 77 seconds to reach minimum safe distance before the cascade effect disabled his own ship along with the assembly fleet. On his tactical display, the countdown timer showed 69 seconds and falling. Around him, the assembly ships continued their routine operations, unaware that their doom had just been activated. In a little over a minute, 12,000 warships would become 12,000 coffins drifting in the darkness of space. Rodriguez had seen a lot of things during his career, but he had never seen anything like what was about to happen to the Star Assembly. The countdown timer on Rodriguez's tactical display showed 58 seconds when the first signs of the cascade effect became visible. It started as a subtle shimmer in space around the quantum resonance device, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. The shimmer spread outward in an expanding sphere, moving at the speed of light toward the surrounding assembly ships. Rodriguez pushed the Shadowhawk's engines to emergency power, accelerating away from the device as fast as his ship's stealth systems would allow. He had to maintain minimal electromagnetic emissions to avoid detection by assembly sensors, but he also had to reach minimum safe distance before the cascade effect caught up with him. The balance between speed and stealth required split-second decisions and perfect execution. 47 seconds. The expanding sphere of quantum disturbance reached the first assembly vessels, destroyer escorts that had been patrolling the inner perimeter of the fleet formation. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. The enemy ships continued their routine operations, their hulls gleaming in the light of distant stars. Then their lights went out. It started with the destroyer's navigation beacons, the bright strobing lights that helped coordinate fleet movements. The beacons flickered once, twice, then died completely. A second later, the ship's running lights failed, leaving their hulls dark against the star field. Within another second, their drive emissions disappeared entirely, their quantum engines falling silent as the cascade effect disrupted the fundamental forces that allowed assembly technology to function. Rodriguez watched in fascination as the effect spread through the enemy formation. Ship after ship went dark as the quantum disturbance washed over them, their technological systems failing in perfect synchronization. The assembly had built their entire civilization on quantum manipulation technologies they didn't fully understand, and now those technologies were being turned against them. 36 seconds. The cascade effect reached a squadron of assembly cruisers, massive ships that had been conducting sensor sweeps of the surrounding space. Rodriguez watched their hulls go dark one after another, 2-kilometer-long vessels reduced to powerless hulks in the space of heartbeats. Emergency lights flickered on briefly as backup power systems tried to compensate for the failure of their primary generators, but even the backup systems were quantum-based. Within seconds, they failed as well. 29 seconds. Rodriguez risked a glance at his own ship systems. The Shadowhawk's quantum phase hull was showing signs of instability, its artificial signature beginning to fluctuate as the cascade effect approached his position. He was still inside the 50-light-year radius that Dr. Kane had calculated, still vulnerable to the same forces that were crippling the assembly fleet. But human technology was different from assembly technology. Humanity had developed their quantum systems based on the Tau Ceti artifacts, giving them an understanding of the underlying principles that the assembly had never achieved. The Shadowhawk systems were designed with quantum isolation protocols that should protect them from the cascade effect. Should being the operative term, Rodriguez had never tested the isolation protocols under battlefield conditions. 22 seconds. The cascade effect reached the assembly flagship Hegemony's Pride, and Rodriguez watched the massive dreadnought go dark section by section. The ship's command towers lost power first, their lights dying as their quantum-based computer systems failed. Then the main hull began losing power, 15 kilometers of armored warship becoming a lifeless derelict in the span of seconds. Rodriguez could imagine the chaos aboard the enemy ships. Gravity generators failing, leaving crews floating helplessly in zero gravity. Life support systems shutting down, forcing personnel into emergency breathing apparatus. Communications networks going dead, leaving ship commanders unable to coordinate with their fleets or even their own crew members. The assembly had never experienced anything like this. For over 2 millennia, their technological superiority had made them virtually invincible. They had crushed dozens of species who dared to resist their authority, always confident that their advanced weapons and defensive systems would ensure victory. Now their weapons were useless, their defenses were down, and their ships were drifting powerless in space. 15 seconds. Rodriguez checked his distance from the device deployment point. 8,000 kilometers and increasing rapidly. The Shadowhawk was performing flawlessly, its engines operating at maximum efficiency while maintaining just enough stealth to avoid detection by any assembly systems that might still be functioning. Not that there were many systems still functioning. The cascade effect had spread throughout the entire fleet formation, turning 12,000 warships into 12,000 pieces of very expensive space junk. Rodriguez had never seen anything so beautiful and terrifying at the same time. 8 seconds. Rodriguez felt a slight vibration through the Shadowhawk's hull as the cascade effect finally reached his position. For a moment, he thought the quantum isolation protocols had failed, and his ship was about to join the assembly fleet in powerless drift. Then the vibration stopped, and his systems returned to normal operation. The isolation protocols had worked. Human technology had proven immune to the same forces that had crippled the most powerful military fleet in galactic history. 5 seconds. Rodriguez activated his communications system and opened a channel to Earth Command. The cascade effect was powerful enough to disrupt quantum communications throughout the local area, but it shouldn't prevent normal radio transmissions at close range. "Shadowhawk to control," he said, unable to keep the excitement out of his voice. "Mission accomplished. Repeat, mission accomplished. Device deployed successfully and cascade effect confirmed. The assembly fleet is completely disabled." 0 seconds. The countdown timer reached 0, and the quantum resonance device completed its activation sequence. The cascade effect had propagated throughout the entire 50 light-year radius, permanently altering the quantum structure of space in ways that would prevent assembly technology from functioning ever again. Rodriguez set course for the edge of the system, pushing the Shadowhawk to maximum speed now that stealth was no longer necessary. Behind him, 12,000 enemy ships drifted in the darkness, their crews trapped aboard powerless vessels with failing life support systems. Some of the ships might have backup life support systems that could keep their crews alive for days or weeks, but without power for their engines or communications, they were effectively removed from the war. "Control to Shadowhawk," Admiral Morrison's voice came through the comm system, distorted by distance and quantum interference but clearly audible. "Outstanding work, Captain. You've just changed the course of galactic history." Rodriguez smiled as he watched the assembly fleet receding behind him on his tactical display. "Control, you should see it from here. 12,000 ships, all dark, not a single functioning system among them." "Copy that, Shadowhawk. We're detecting massive power failures throughout the enemy formation. Dr. Kane's calculations were correct. The cascade effect has disabled their entire fleet." Rodriguez thought about Dr. Kane and her team of scientists who had made this moment possible. They had taken ancient artifacts from a dead civilization and turned them into humanity's salvation. The Assembly had ruled the galaxy for over 2 millennia, but they had built their empire on borrowed technology they didn't understand. Now that borrowed technology had become their downfall. "Control," Rodriguez said. "What's the status of our own fleet?" "All human vessels are operating normally," Morrison replied. "The quantum isolation protocols protected our ships completely. We're moving to secure the disabled assembly vessels and provide humanitarian assistance to their crews." Rodriguez nodded. Even in victory, humanity would show mercy to their defeated enemies. It was one of the things that distinguished humans from the assembly, one of the reasons why the galaxy would be a better place under human leadership. As the Shadowhawk cleared the outer edge of the assembly formation, Rodriguez got his first clear view of the entire enemy fleet. 12,000 ships stretched across space in perfect formation, their hulls dark and lifeless. It was the largest collection of disabled warships in galactic history, a monument to the dangers of technological arrogance. "Shadowhawk to control," he reported. "I'm clear of the enemy formation and beginning return flight to Earth, estimated arrival in 6 hours." "Copy that, Captain. We'll have a reception committee waiting for you." Rodriguez settled back in his pilot's seat and engaged the autopilot for the return flight. Around him, the Shadowhawk systems hummed quietly as the ship headed home. The mission was complete, the assembly fleet was neutralized, and humanity had won the most important victory in its history. But Rodriguez knew this was just the beginning. The star assembly represented 12 species spread across hundreds of star systems. Disabling their fleet was a crucial first step, but it wouldn't end their threat permanently. They would attempt to rebuild their military forces using non-quantum technologies, and they would probably seek allies among other species who feared human expansion. The war was far from over, but for the first time in 3 years, humanity had reason to hope. Rodriguez activated his personal log and began recording his mission report. Future historians would want a detailed account of the operation that had saved the human species, and he owed it to them to provide an accurate record of events. Personal log, Captain Marcus Rodriguez, Commanding Officer Reconnaissance Vessel Shadowhawk. Mission date, December 12, 2025. Mission objective, deployment of quantum resonance device within assembly fleet formation. He paused, looking out at the stars that now belonged to humanity instead of the assembly. Mission status, complete success. The Star Assembly fleet has been permanently disabled through quantum cascade effect. Estimated enemy casualties, 0 killed, approximately 15 million personnel stranded aboard powerless vessels. Human casualties, 0. Rodriguez thought about the message President Santos had broadcast 3 years ago when the Assembly first delivered their ultimatum. She had promised that humanity would never surrender, that they would fight regardless of the odds against them. Today, that promise had been fulfilled in ways the Assembly had never imagined. Additional notes, Rodriguez continued. The enemy never saw us coming. They prepared for a conventional war against a technologically inferior opponent. They didn't prepare for an enemy that understood their technology better than they understood it themselves. 6 hours later, the Shadowhawk docked at Earth Command's orbital facility. Rodriguez climbed out of his ship to find Admiral Morrison, Dr. Kane, and dozens of other personnel waiting for him in the docking bay. The expression on their faces told him everything he needed to know about how the galaxy had changed during his mission. "Captain," Admiral Morrison said, stepping forward to shake his hand. "On behalf of the United Earth government and the entire human species, thank you. You've given us our freedom." Rodriguez looked around at the faces surrounding him, people who had spent 3 years preparing for what they thought would be humanity's final battle. They had expected to fight against overwhelming odds with little hope of survival. Instead, they had achieved a victory so complete that their enemies would need decades to recover. "Admiral," Rodriguez said, "what's our next move?" Morrison smiled. "We're going to do something the galaxy has never seen before. We're going to build an empire based on freedom instead of oppression. And we're going to start by offering aid to the Assembly crews stranded in their disabled ships." Dr. Kane stepped forward, carrying a data pad with preliminary analysis of the cascade effect's results. "Captain, the quantum alterations appear to be permanent. The Assembly will have to completely rebuild their technological base using non-quantum principles. It could take them centuries to reach their previous capabilities." Rodriguez nodded, and in the meantime, Admiral Morrison said, "humanity has become the dominant military power in this region of the galaxy. The question is what we're going to do with that power." Rodriguez thought about the billions of human beings throughout the solar system who could now look to the stars with hope instead of fear. He thought about his sister Maria and his nephew David, who would grow up in a galaxy where humanity was respected instead of threatened. Most importantly, he thought about the message this victory would send to every oppressed species in the galaxy. The Star Assembly had ruled through fear and technological superiority. But fear was a weak foundation for an empire, and technological superiority was meaningless without the wisdom to use it properly. Humanity would show the galaxy a different way. "Admiral," Rodriguez said, "I have a suggestion for our next move." "What's that, Captain?" Rodriguez smiled as he looked out through the docking bay's viewport at the stars that now belonged to the free peoples of the galaxy. "Let's go introduce ourselves to our new neighbors. I think they're going to be very interested in what we have to offer." The age of human dominion had begun, but unlike the empires that had come before, this one would be built on cooperation instead of conquest, on hope instead of fear. The Star Assembly had threatened humanity with extinction, and humanity had responded by offering the galaxy a chance at freedom. It was, Rodriguez thought, a very human way to win a war.